After being released for nearly 2 years, Blaise is sent back to prison following her second conviction. Blaise has, at this point, been convicted by 2 different juries for the murder of Duran Bailey. Her first trial in 2002, she was convicted of first-degree murder. That conviction was overturned. Her second trial in 2006, she was convicted of manslaughter. Both of her trials, Blaise was also convicted of necrophilia, forcing her to register as a sex offender. Hans Sherrer is a journalist that runs a nonprofit called Justice Denied and has been working on wrongful convictions for more than 2 decades, and Hans became involved in Blaise's case. Following the second trial, Hans tracked down some of the jurors to learn more about why Blaise was convicted.
Because I did contact the jurors and I met with a number of them. There were several jurors that were holding out for acquittal. There was a holiday coming up. I don't remember which one it was. They said that they didn't want to be deliberating over the holiday, and so they came to this compromise. They forced the compromise for her to only be convicted of manslaughter. In talking to those jurors, they were convinced that Blaise was not guilty, so I think they should have stuck to their guns instead of coming to this compromise so they could go home.
In December of 2007, Blaise's legal team filed an appeal with the Nevada Supreme Court, and then she waits. In 2009, 2 years after Blaise went back to prison, the Nevada Supreme Court upholds her conviction. The United States Supreme Court follows suit as well. While Blaise sat in female prison in Las Vegas, her case began to gain momentum on the outside, and she had innumerous supporters. 225,000 people signed a petition asking the Clark County District Attorney to test DNA in Blaise's case. Things like semen, cigarette butts, chewing gum, and more. The Innocence Project also gets involved with Blaise's case and offers to pay for DNA testing of those items. There was a free Kirsten Lobato website and social media pages, all with people who adamantly believed Blaise was innocent. But 2 of Blaise's most staunch supporters were Michelle Revelle and Hans Sherrer. Michelle had picked up all of the evidence in Blaise's case from the Clark County Public Defender's Office after her second conviction, and the time was ticking. You have 1 year to file a Writ of Habeas Corpus petition, which was Blaise's next legal step. A Writ of Habeas Corpus is a way to ask the courts to re-look at the case based on new evidence. Just days after Blaise's second conviction, Hans and Michelle combed through thousands of photographs of Duran Bailey at the crime scene, and Hans noticed something.
The first photos were of the outside of the trash enclosure, and so they continually took photos as they were peeling off all of the layers of trash and cardboard that had been placed over his body. And when they finally got to where his body was completely exposed, that photo struck me that his body looked in such perfect condition. It's like he'd only been laying there for 5 minutes. It just seems to me that if someone was going to be laying in a trash enclosure open to the weather in Las Vegas in July, the heat of July, that signs of decomposition and particularly since it was in a trash enclosure, there'd be indications of, rats or mice or cockroaches or something, but there was nothing. Got Michelle and I said, have you seen these photos? And she said, well, yeah. And it's like, well, doesn't it strike you strange that his body looks in such perfect condition? The prosecution's whole case is that he'd been laying in this trash enclosure for approximately 18 hours, all through the day.
Hans was wondering why, if a bloody body had been laying out all day in the Las Vegas heat, had no bugs found their way to this body. Hans Sherrer contacted a forensic entomologist named Dr. Gail Anderson.
So a forensic entomologist is somebody who studies the insects associated with primarily a dead body. And the number one thing we're called in to assist with is to estimate how long that person has been dead. Mr. Sherrer, Hans Sherrer, was the first one who contacted me from Justice Denied. And he said he had photographs from this old case. Could I do anything? And my first answer was no. I can't look at a photograph of a bunch of maggots or a body and give you a time of death. So as soon as he started to tell me about this, I said, well, hang on, you're telling me this is midsummer, this is in very hot weather, this is a body that's covered in blood, and you're saying he could have been dead for 10, 24 hours during the full daytime? I said, yeah, let me look at the photographs. So from that minute onward, it was pretty obvious that there was something wrong. There were no blowflies. In this case, there were no insects. And that's the point, because there should have been. Testimony of other people had suggested that the body had been there all day, or certainly many hours during the day. And if they had, then blowflies would have been attracted to the body immediately after death. Blowflies will come to a body very, very quickly after death, within usually minutes or seconds.
According to prosecutors, Duran Bailey was killed sometime before dawn on July 8th. They believed his body was left outside in the Vegas heat before he was discovered at about 10 p.m. that night. Dr. Anderson says blowflies are only active during the day, so the lack of blowflies present means the timeline put forward by the prosecution was impossible, and says based on the lack of blowflies, Duran Bailey died after sunset on July 8th, and that's a time when Blaise had a solid alibi. July 8th, the sun set at 8:01, so they determined that's the earliest Duran Bailey could have been murdered. Dr. Anderson consulted with multiple other forensic entomologists, all who came to that same conclusion.
The situation was so perfect for insects to colonize if he'd been lying out there at 4 o'clock in the afternoon or at noon.
How accurate is entomology?
It's very accurate. It's been used many, many, many times. People are a bit inclined to think it's a new science. It goes back to the 10th century in China.
Dr. Anderson says there were no blowflies in any of the pictures that she had of Duran Bailey, and she looked at thousands. I asked Dr. Anderson if it's possible she just couldn't see the blowflies in pictures. She says no, she would have seen them.
I saw thousands of photographs. We saw everything of the body. They would have laid close to wounds, close to natural orifices, when the body had been removed. So presumably this was probably early in the morning of the next day. We're just beginning to see some blowflies come in and land on the blood that's left there.
In previous episodes, we've detailed how the time of death went from 10 hours to 12 to 18, possibly 24, following the testimony from the medical examiner, Dr. Larry Sims. Initially, the time of death was such a small window, Blaise could not have committed the murder. Then Dr. Sims opened it up. Then he opened the time up even more, to eventually include a time when Blaise didn't have an alibi. Something that could have cleared a lot of things up is what time was Duran Bailey murdered.
The original pathologist changed his mind on the time frame 3 or 4 times. Why did he change his mind? And also, why was that not questioned in court?
Hans Sherrer also contacted multiple other experts, including Dr. Glenn Larkin, and this was all for Blaise's Writ of Habeas Corpus petition. Dr. Glenn Larkin said he believes the murder of Duran Bailey was committed by multiple people, and he said also, based on the way Duran Bailey's penis was amputated, the person who did it at least had a background in animal husbandry. From the Writ of Habeas Corpus petition, he said the perpetrator either had some medical knowledge or experience in skinning an animal. Could Blaise, who was admittedly high out of her mind on meth, have such a skilled hand? The Writ of Habeas Corpus petition to have Blaise released from prison is more than 700 pages, with more than 79 new pieces of evidence. For Hans, who worked on this, the most interesting piece of new evidence had to do with those shoe prints that were left on the cardboard found on Duran Bailey's body.
I think the shoe print evidence was absolutely exculpatory. George Shiro, who was shoe print expert from Louisiana, wrote, I believe it was 3 or 4 reports that were included with her habeas, detailing, he laid it out step by step. The shoe prints that were found on the cardboard in the trash enclosure could only have been made by the person who murdered Duran Bailey.
For me, looking at the Writ of Habeas Corpus petition, the most compelling new piece of evidence is the affidavit of Stephen King. Stephen King signed an affidavit in Blaise's defense after Hans Sherrer painstakingly tracked him down.
Stephen King was Diane Parker's live-in boyfriend. Got the name, a list of everybody in the United States with his name, and I just started calling. I just lucked out that he answered the phone.
Diane Parker reported to police that Duran Bailey had raped her on July 1st. The same day before she was raped, Diane Parker told police that Duran Bailey broke into her apartment when she was with friends, and he slapped her. The friends and Duran Bailey got into a physical altercation. Later that day is when Diane Parker says Duran Bailey came back and raped her. 4 days after that, Diane Parker went to police and told police Duran Bailey was going to kill her. That officer told her, "You gotta do what you gotta do to keep yourself safe." 3 days after Duran Bailey is found murdered, Diane Parker lived with Stephen King, and Duran Bailey's body was found just yards from where Diane Parker and Stephen lived. Here's attorney Stephen Jackson.
They do not investigate further, which has always just blown my mind. It seems to be the two obvious people who you would want to investigate for the rest of the day.
Stephen King says Diane Parker was with him until Diane's death in 2005.
He was convinced that Blaise was innocent, and that came through in his affidavit. And he indicated that Diane also, was convinced that Blaise was innocent. The most likely people that killed Duran Bailey were what have been referred to as her Mexican friends who lived in the same apartment complex, which was right next door to where Duran Bailey's body was discovered. You can literally jump over a fence from where they lived to where Duran Bailey's body was found. Based on what Diane told me, what I personally know about St. Louis, after we talked yesterday, it occurred to me there's information about him that you probably aren't aware of. He just states, "I am absolutely certain that Kirsten Blaise Lobato did not murder St. Louis. I believe that Kirsten Blaise Lobato is innocent, and her conviction is a miscarriage of justice." He was willing to pay his own way, even though he was living on Social Security. He was willing to buy a bus ticket to Las Vegas if it was necessary for him to testify in court.
In the affidavit, Stephen says he and Diane spoke countless times about Duran Bailey's murder, and Stephen says he absolutely believes Diane Parker's friends, who witnessed Duran Bailey break into her apartment and hit her, he believes they are the ones who killed Duran Bailey. They did so to protect Diane. He also says Diane's friends knew about the rape and other attacks on women at the hands of Duran Bailey. Stephen King said he had heard about Kirsten Blaise Lobato getting convicted and said from everything Diane had told him, including the injuries inflicted on Duran Bailey, he said he's absolutely certain Kirsten Lobato did not murder Duran Bailey. So another thing Blaise's team started to do was trying to track down Diane Parker's friends. Detective Thowson testified in court. He looked into them and said they were stand-up citizens. A private investigator hired by the defense found some of Diane Parker's friends were in the country illegally. That investigator also found that some of the men left the country shortly after the murder.
Well, I actually located two of them. Around the time that her habeas petition was being prepared, the interest would have been to try to get their DNA to match it with the DNA that had been recovered from the crime scene. At least one of them was using the Social Security of a man who had been dead for a period of years. Some of them were definitely in the country illegally.
Hans Sherrer also wanted to learn more about Duran Bailey and his criminal past. In a conversation with police, Diane Parker mentioned Duran Bailey had been in prison in Missouri for murder, and Hans wanted to know more. Prior to moving to Las Vegas, Duran Bailey lived in Missouri, which is where he got his street nickname, St. Louis. Hans requested Duran Bailey's records in Las Vegas, as well as his from Missouri.
So he moved to Las Vegas when he was about 40 years old. I believe it was Diane Parker in her police statement said that he had told her that he'd been in prison in Missouri for murder. So I was wondering, well, how did he get out? So what I did is I sent public records requests. I sent records requests to the St. Louis Department of Corrections, City of St. Louis Police Department. I believe it's St. Louis also has it's a county. And then I also sent requesting any records related to his crimes he committed or arrests. I also sent a record request to the FBI. All of the police organizations in St. Louis responded that they had no records that he had ever even been arrested in the state of Missouri. And then I received the response to my records request to the FBI, and they stated the records responsive to your FOIA request were destroyed on August 1st, 1995. So the FBI destroyed Duran Bailey's FBI file when he was about 35 years old, because in 1995 he was roughly 35. It would appear that he was an informant, and that could have been that maybe he really was in prison for murder in Missouri, and he made some kind of deal to provide information of some sort in exchange for being released from prison, having his records wiped out.
In September 2010, Blaise's team also filed a 43-page motion to have Blaise's Writ of Habeas Corpus petition heard by a judge who was not Judge Vega. They maintained Judge Vega had not been unbiased in her previous rulings on the case, and they believed she would continue to act that way.
Well, she might have started out the case being neutral before Blaise's first trial, but after Blaise was convicted in 2002, she certainly took the attitude that she was guilty and she was going to do everything possible to make sure that she stayed convicted. I actually wrote an article in which I believe the title of it was, "Is Judge Vega the Most Corrupt Judge in the United States?" And I detailed in it that Judge Vega made more than 200 consecutive rulings against Blaise and in favor of the prosecution, which is almost statistically incomprehensible that anybody could do that.
That motion was heard by another judge who dismissed it, saying, quote, "Judge Vega is a fine judge." Judge Vega filed a response to the motion denying that she's biased against Blaise.
Well, I'll tell you how she was convicted. Valerie Vega convicted her. She was dead set on making sure that she was convicted, and she misused her position as a judge.
Blaise's Writ of Habeas Corpus petition is filed in 2010. For years, Blaise waits in prison for a response. And then, Judge Vega retires. That's next on Presumption of Guilt.